Welcome to Python Basics Lesson 3. In this session, we're going to be looking at functions and procedures and a bit of string manipulation. This lesson is in a series of 9 lessons focusing on paper 4 of the A-level syllabus from Cambridge. If you're also studying IGCSE computer science, the first 5 lessons will be relevant to you. Otherwise, if you're interested in programming, especially Python programming, you'll learn a lot of skills. The overall structure that we're following is on screen. We've covered this before, so I'm not going to go through this. Let's start by looking at what functions and procedures actually are and how Python deals with them. Now, in the previous lessons, you were writing a bit of code and it was sequential. So you start with the first line, then you write another line, you might have a loop, you might have a selection, but everything was in one program. The beauty of programming is that we can take a modular approach. So code that can often be repeated or asked for a number of times, we can put them in functions or procedures, and that makes code reusable and allows us to test pieces of code and create program libraries and all sorts of things which make programming efficient and allow other programmers to access the modules that have been created by perhaps people before us, instead of repeating the same code and writing the same thing again and again and again. So functions and basically procedures are just a block of code which only runs when it's called. If you don't call it, it will just stay there, it won't do anything. Now you can pass data to these functions which are known as parameters, and generally procedures and functions are the same thing in Python from the implementation point of view. The only difference between functions and procedures is that functions will return a value back or multiple values back to the main program. Procedures will just do something and that's the end of it. They will not return anything back to the main program. Another difference is that procedures are just called, whereas because the function is returning a value back to the main program, it has to be assigned to a variable. Both of these are implemented the same way using a definition statement. In this case, I'm defining the name function or procedure. It's a procedure because it's not returning anything back to the main program, and this name procedure will just print hello on the screen. Now, how do I call this procedure? If I want to use this procedure in the main program, I will have to type in name and 2 round brackets. Now, you have been using procedures and functions a lot. Remember, input brackets, print brackets, all of these are procedures and functions which have been already coded in Python's programming library, so you don't need to write it from scratch. Length of something, perhaps an array, function if it returns something back. Okay, let's practice this, writing procedures, and especially procedures that take in a parameter. So have a go at practice question 1, where you need to create a greeting function, and when you pass in a name, it outputs hello, whatever the name is. So for example, if I call greeting, round brackets, a string in there called parole, it should print out hello parole. Just remember that in the definition of greeting, in the round brackets, you will need to put a name or a variable that will be used by that particular program. That's the only hint I'll give you. Pause the video, have a go, and then continue on to check a possible solution. Hopefully you got something like this: def greeting, brackets name, and print hello, the name. Now, when you want to call this in the main program, you'll just simply write greeting and parole or name or whatever else it is. You could modify the program by asking the user for an input. That input is stored in name, and then this procedure is called to say a greeting to them. If you couldn't work this out, then code this and test it out. Remember, you will need to call it, and if you're not sure about how to call a procedure, all you need to do is write the name of the procedure, brackets, and whatever parameter you're going to send to it. Okay, let's try another question. Practice question 2 states, create a function for average in which it takes the sum and count as parameters. So you're putting 2 values into it now, and then this will return a value back to the main program. Now we're using a function, so there has to be a keyword to return average. So the keyword return is of vital importance here. Return and then average, which returns the value back to the main program. And in the main program, you will need to create a variable where you will assign this function and its relevant arguments. Now, what's the difference between arguments and parameters? When you're calling a function or procedure, you're passing arguments. They actually have data value. Whereas parameters are part of the function definition statement or a procedure definition statement, and they're just placeholders. They don't actually have a value until you pass a value into them. So pause the video, have a go at coding this, and then continue to check a possible solution. Hopefully you got something like this. You defined the average function. It takes two parameters in, sum and count. Average is then worked out, which is equal to sum divided by count. And then you return average back to the main program using the return keyword. And in the main program, you got a variable. In this case, we call it answer, which is equal to average. And then we're passing in two arguments to it, which are 520. And then you print the answer out. Something along the lines of this. Now, if you couldn't do this, pause the video, code this and test it out, see if it works, use a calculator to check your answer, and if you're okay with it, continue on. Let's do practice question 3. You now need to create a function to display the multiplication table of the number which is passed on as a parameter. Now the user can pass any number into this program, and this function should be able to create a table like this. So the output should be as follows. You can see the output on screen. So here you're taking an input and you're passing that input into a function, and that function will then create this table. Now, this really is actually a procedure because it's outputting things and it's not actually returning anything back to the main program. But because Python doesn't care about procedures, the terminology is functions for everything, so I'm going to be calling these functions for now. So please be aware that this technically is a procedure, but because the terminology in Python is all functions, we're just going to call these functions, just to ensure consistency with how everybody else speaks around the world. Okay, pause the video and have a go, and then continue to check the answer. Hopefully you got something like this. You created a function called table, you pass in an input, and then you use a loop to create the multiplication table, and then you print it out. If you couldn't do this, pause the video and have a go. Of course, it's missing a couple of lines. The input statement is missing, and then the function call is missing where you pass on that input to the function. However, I'll leave that up to you. You've got to practice this yourself. For practice question 4, create a function for finding the largest value in an array and then print the multiplication table of that number. The array you should be using is on screen. The largest value quite clearly is 96. Now here, I want you to reuse your multiplication table function from the last practice question. So technically, you should have two functions in this one. The first one will work out the largest value, which then passes it on to the second function, which you've already written. There is no point in writing that code again or creating a new function that does everything. We're dealing with the reusability of code here, okay? So two functions is what I'm looking for in this particular question. Pause the video, have a go, and then when you're ready, continue on to check a possible solution. Hopefully you've got a solution like this. You've got the array, you've got your table definition that's already been created. You created a new large definition which takes that particular array and then works out what the largest number is and then returns the large number back to the main program. So what's happening is you're going to create a variable called temp, and in there you're going to call the large function, and then you're going to use that for your table. If you couldn't do this, pause the video and then type the code in and then test it to see if it works for you before continuing. Now we're just going to touch base with the linear search function here. We're going to focus on this in a bit more detail in a future lesson as well, but what I want you to do is just have a look at how we define a linear search function. And this technique will be used when we study linear search in a bit more depth in a future lesson. You're going to pass an array as a parameter along with the string value which you're supposed to find. So in this array, we want to find something, and then we're going to use a loop to compare the value to whatever we're trying to find and return that back. Now, why am I focusing on this right now? Because the next practice question is going to utilize kind of like a linear search, and I just wanted to front load you so you know how this function works. So study this function and then have a go at practice question 5, where you're creating an array with 5 names and you're going to get the user to input a name, and then using a function you're going to search that particular array to find the name and either output found at index position 4 or output name does not exist in the array. So pause the video and have a go and then continue on to check a possible solution. On screen, you see a possible solution to this. You've got a names array with a few names. You take a variable input name and get the user to input another name that they're looking for. You create a function which is going to take the array and the input as parameters and then you're going to search it using a loop and a selection, and if it's found or not found, depending on whichever way you've implemented it, it either outputs the position or says it does not exist in the array. And then you're going to call that particular function from the main program. Because we're not returning anything, technically it's a procedure, but we know that Python calls it a function. So search, names array, and input name are the two arguments that are passed to the function, and it should tell you whether the name exists or not. Now, if you couldn't do this, pause the video, code this, and test it out. You should start getting familiar with how functions work and how they're called. And if you're not, take your time with it. You do not need to rush through this because functions are very critical for paper 4. You will be asked to use these. You need to be comfortable in coding them. Now, this is something that I do in a new lesson to check understanding of the code, but I thought I'll just leave that in the video so people at home can also test their skills of finding bugs in a code out. And this also gives you a greater understanding of how the code works. There are 5 mistakes in this program. Can you find them all? If you found them, write them in the comments. If you couldn't find them, then compare the code to the previous code, and that should kind of give you a hint. Some are very obvious, others might require you to have an eagle eye. Pause the video, check that out, and continue. I'm not going to share the answers. I think they're pretty straightforward. We're now going to move on to string manipulation. Now, we already know at times we need to join strings, but there are times where we also might need to break or split things apart. So strings need to be manipulated. And we normally use a technique called slicing to slice a particular string into 2 or more parts. Now, Python is pretty clever here. It automatically creates a list of individual characters where each character can be referenced individually, just like you would reference an item in an array. So if you typed in a name and you say name square bracket 3, it will get you the 4th character of that name because obviously it starts with 0. So 0, 1, 2, 3 is actually the 4th character. On screen you see an example. I'm going to assign random name to a variable called name, and then I'm going to say print name square bracket 0, and that's going to print the first character out, which is R. What if we wanted more characters? Well, because every string is actually stored kind of like an array, even if you're using a variable, you could use the same technique. So here what I'm doing is simply assigning random name to name, and then in the first name variable I'm simply going to say name start with 0 and bring 6 characters back. So the first 6 characters are going to be stored in first name, which is random, and we do the same thing for second name, and then we print both of those out. So it's very easy for us to split a string in Python compared to other programming languages. Okay, let's have a go at practice question 6. Use a variable to store a name without a space, for example, Pete Townsend, just like we did random name. Separate the first name and the last name using the fixed character method. Output these in the following statement. Your first name is Pete and your second name is Townsend. So this builds on what we just did, and if you understood that piece of code, you should be able to code this without any particular problem. For an additional challenge, you might want to create a function and pass things on to that, but I will just be coding it as a normal program. So pause the video and then continue to check a possible solution. So hopefully you've got something like this. You've got your own name in, then you've got 2 variables where you split that particular string into 2 parts, and then you've got an output statement which uses those variables. If you were coding a function, then you split the string and then you pass first name and second name as parameters in that function call, and then you use that to output the same statement. Now sometimes we need to work out the length of a string, and that's again pretty straightforward. Just like an array, we can use the built-in length function, or len, L-E-N, and all you need to do is have a string, most likely in a variable, and then to another variable, in this case temp, we can just simply use len, L-E-N. This is a built-in function, and then we pass the parameter name, and that's going to assign whatever the length of that string is, or that array is, into the temp variable, and then we can print this out. Please do remember that spaces are also counted because space is an ASCII character, and to a computer that has value. So just be careful when you're dealing with strings with spaces. Okay, let's have a go at practice question 7. Take a name as an input. So a name could be entered by a user, in this case Aditi Patel. Separate the first name and the second name. Output the name like the following. First name is Aditi, second name is Patel. Now try to work out the separator between both parts of the name and use that to work out the starting and end lengths of your string. So this one is very useful because sometimes when you're dealing with file handling, there are things called comma separated values, and the separator will need to be used to split different parts of data in a text file. So this will be very useful when we deal with file handling later on in the series of lessons as well. In this particular case, when the user is typing a name, they're probably using a space character as a split between first name and a second name. So you need to target that. Pause the video, have a go, and then continue on. Now, if you can't do it, you might just want to have a look at the code and then code it yourself so you get used to coding and splitting strings. On screen, you can see a possible solution. We take the name as an input. We then say the first length begins at 0. The total length is the length of the entire name string. And then we're going to use a loop, which is then going to check for that space character. And then it's going to create a counter that keeps on adding 1 to the first length. So remember, it starts with 0. We already know that. So we're just going to see where the space character is, and then we're going to use first len to work out the split. Okay, so it's just a bit of logic, and once we work out, well, okay, the space character is at position 5 or 6 or whatever else, then we know that the first name starts at 0 and ends at that particular place. So we need to just get that many characters back, and then we can do the same thing for last name, because the last name begins after it, so it's first length plus 1, that's the starting point, till the end of the length of that particular name string. So once we work both of those out, we can then output it. If you couldn't do this, try to code this so you can understand this better. It's just a bit of manipulation and a bit of logic, and it'll make sense once you've coded it. Now, of course, these aren't the only functions available. There are tons of these. So on screen, you can see a lot of functions where you can work out a string and change it into lowercase. This is built into Python. Name.lower changes everything to lowercase. Name.upper changes everything to uppercase. Name.capitalize, especially American capitalize because Python was developed in America, is going to change it to sentence case with the first character as a capital letter and the rest as lowercase. Sometimes maybe you might want to find the index position of a particular phrase or a character, and we can use name.index and it will tell us what position that is. This is built in. So instead of you working it out by doing a loop and selection statement, you can just use name.index, find the index of m, and it'll print that out for you. And we can also strip things out, where we can simply say remove the letter E from a particular string or something else, name.strip, and whatever's in the brackets is stripped out. Now there are a huge amount of other built-in functions, too many to know. The link can show you all of those. You can see that little link on screen. I will also put that in the description of this particular video so you can have a go at those. In the exam, you don't really need to use most of these. The only common ones are going to be lower, upper, capitalize, and so forth. Even the index one is too much. And with that, we bring the lesson to a close. Hopefully you've understood the use of procedures and functions and how everything is a function in Python. But if it returns a value, it's a true function, otherwise it acts as a procedure. You understood the use of built-in functions like length, input, print, how they're coded already, they're pre-tested, so you know they work. You understood the need for manipulating strings, why we need to join them, which is concatenation. We did that a couple of lessons ago, and how we can split strings and work out the individual parts. You also understand the use of separator characters like spaces and commas, and you can use those to split strings. Hopefully you use some common string manipulation functions. Now if you haven't used those, which was the last particular section of this video, then I would suggest code them and have a go at utilizing them. And finally, you can code procedures or functions in programs and use them at your will. So make sure that you know that functions are reusable, so once you code them, they exist. And you can create functions which are local, only useful for your program, or you can create functions which are part of a program library and can be used across the board. So if you want to understand how to do that, which is beyond the scope of this particular syllabus, you can do a quick search online and you can find multiple videos that can guide you on how to do that, which will make your life very easy as a programmer, because you don't need to code the same thing again and again and again. You can use the functions that you created now maybe 10 years down the line, and they'll still work. Okay, that's it for today's video. If you've got any questions, as usual, post them in the comments, and I will see you in the next one.